Hello, Love and the Creators. It is Friday evening, and I'm going to continue with The Book Thief, starting on page 468. You'll remember in class today what happened is one of the Holzapfel boys came home, Michael, and his brother died when they were in Stalingrad. But he's home and he's lost 3 fingers. And he came by because he came to Rose's because he wanted his mother wanted Liesel to come and read to her. So we're on page 468. Page 468. Liesel's leaving her house and she's following Michael to Frau Holzapfel's. Mama, Rosa raised her hand. Go. Liesel waited. I said go. Oh, and he'd also confirmed that he had seen Rose's and Hans's son alive in Stalingrad. All right? As far as I know, he's alive, he told her. When she got up to him, the returned soldier tried to make conversation. He must have regretted his verbal mistake with Rosa, and he tried to bury it beneath some other words. Holding up the bandaged hand, he said, I still can't get it to stop bleeding. Liesel was actually glad to enter the Holzapfel's kitchen. The sooner she started reading, the better. Frau Holzapfel sat with wet streams of wire on her face. Her son was dead. But that was only the half of it. She would never really know how it occurred, but I can tell you without question that one of us here knows. I always seem to know what happens when there is snow and guns and the various confusions of human language. When I imagine Frau Holzapfel's kitchen from the book thief's words, I don't see the stove or the wooden spoons or the water pump or anything of that sort. Not to begin with, anyway. What I see is the Russian winter and the snow falling from the ceiling and the fate of Frau Holzapfel's second son. His name was Robert, and what happened to him was this. A small war story. His legs were blown off at the shins, and he died with his brother watching in a cold, stench-filled hospital. It was Russia, January 5th, 1941, and just another icy day. Out among the city in snow, there were dead Russians and Germans everywhere. Those who remained were firing into the blank pages in front of them, 3 languages interwoven, the Russian, the bullets, the German. Interesting that it refers to bullets as a language. That's interesting. As I made my way through the fallen souls, one of the men was saying, "My stomach is itchy." He said it many times over. Despite his shock, he crawled up ahead to a dark, disfigured figure who sat streaming on the ground. When the soldier with the wounded stomach arrived, he could see that it was Robert Holzapfel. His hands were caked in blood, and he was heaping snow upon the area just above his shins, where his legs had been chopped off by the last explosion. There were hot hands and a red scream. Steam rose from the ground, the sight and smell of rotting snow. Again, that's an interesting description, rotting snow. Snow doesn't rot, but with blood and dead body parts on it, dying body parts, rotting snow. "It's me," the soldier said to him. "It's Peter." He dragged himself a few inches closer. "Peter," Robert asked, a vanishing voice. He must have felt me nearby. A second time, "Peter?" For some reason, dying men always ask questions they know the answer to. Perhaps it's so they can die being right. I think Peter died. The voices suddenly all sounded the same. Robert Holzapfel collapsed to his right onto the cold and steamy ground. I'm sure he expected to meet me there and then. He didn't. Unfortunately for the young German, I did not take him that afternoon. I stepped over him with the other poor souls in my arms and made my way back to the Russians. Back and forth I traveled. Disassembled men. It was no ski trip, I can tell you. Back and forth. Dying Russians, dying Germans. As Michael told his mother, it was 3 long days later that I finally came for the soldier who left his feet behind in Stalingrad. I showed up very much invited at the temporary hospital and flinched at the smell. A man with a bandaged hand was telling the mute, shock-faced soldier that he would survive. "You'll soon be going home," he assured him. Yes, home, I thought, for good. "I'll wait for you," he continued. "I was going back at the end of the week, but I'll wait." In the middle of his brother's next sentence, I gathered up the soul of Robert Holzapfel. Usually I need to exert myself to look through the ceiling when I'm inside, but I was lucky in that particular building. A small section of the roof had been destroyed, and I could see straight up. A meter away, Michael Holzapfel was still talking. I tried to ignore him by watching the hole above me. The sky was white but deteriorating fast. As always, it was becoming an enormous drop sheet. Blood was bleeding through and in patches. The clouds were dirty, like footprints in melting snow. Footprints, you ask? Well, I wonder whose those could be. In Frau Holzapfel's kitchen, Liesel read. The pages waited by unheard, and for me, when the Russian scenery fades in my eyes, the snow refuses to stop falling from the ceiling. The kettle is covered, as is the table. The humans, too, are wearing patches of snow on their heads and shoulders. The brother shivers, the woman weeps, and the girl goes on reading, for that's why she's there, and it feels good to be good for something in the aftermath of the snows of Stalingrad. Stalingrad, which is St. Petersburg, where our museum is. The Hermitage is in St. Petersburg, but it was called Stalingrad at that time, the communist name. And kind of interesting to have that connection there. But Liesel, her reading helps cover the mother's grief and the brother's sadness and frustration. The Ageless Brother. Liesel Memminger was a few weeks short of 14. Her papa was still away. She'd completed 3 more reading sessions with a devastated woman. On many nights, she'd watched Rosa sit with the accordion and pray with her chin on top of the bellows. Now, she thought, it's time. Usually it was stealing that cheered her up, but on this day it was giving something back. She reached under her bed and removed the plate. As quickly as she could, she cleaned it in the kitchen and made her way out. It felt nice to be walking up through Molching. The air was sharp and flat, like the Vaschen of a sadistic teacher or nun. Her shoes were the only sound on Munich Street. Remember the plate with the cookies? She's taking the plate back to the library, back to Ilse. As she crossed the river, a rumor of sunshine stood behind the clouds. At 8 Grande Strasse, she walked up the steps, left the plate by the front door, and knocked. And by the time the door was opened, the girl was around the corner. Liesel did not look back, but she knew that if she did, she'd have found her brother at the bottom of the steps again, his knee completely healed. She could even hear his voice. That's better, Liesel. Remember, when the day that she started screaming at Frau what's her last name, Ilse, the mayor's wife, of course, that she saw her brother telling her, "Don't be so mean," and now the brother that she imagines in her mind is telling her, "That's better, Liesel." She brought the plate back. It was with great sadness that she realized that her brother would be 6 forever. But when she held that thought, she also made an effort to smile. She remained at the Amper River at the bridge where Papa used to stand and lean. She smiled, and when it all came out, she walked home and her brother never climbed into her sleep again. In many ways, she would miss him, but she could never miss his deadly eyes on the floor of the train or the sound of a cough that killed. Interesting. Her nightmares with her brother have come to an end. He never climbed into her sleep again. The book thief lay in bed that night, and the boy only came before she closed her eyes. He was one member of a cast, for Liesel was always visited in that room. Her papa stood and called her half a woman. Max was writing the word shaker in the corner. Rudy was naked by the door. Occasionally her mother stood on a bedside train platform. And far away, in the room that stretched like a bridge to a nameless town, her brother, Werner, played in the cemetery snow. From down the hall, a metronome for the visions. Rosa snored, and Liesel lay awake, surrounded, but also remembering a quote from her most recent book. By the way, do you know what a metronome is? A metronome is sometimes people have a piano, and it's a thing that you wind up, and it's kind of like a reverse grandfather clock. It's got a thing that goes tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, and it keeps beat so you can play. So Rosa's snores are the metronome. The regular sound of this in and out sound are the metronome for her visions. Rosa snored and Liesel lay awake surrounded, but also remembering a quote from her most recent book, The Last Human Stranger, page 38. There were people everywhere in the city street, but the stranger could not have been more alone if it were empty. When morning came, the visions were gone, and she could hear the quiet recital of words in the living room. Rosa was sitting with the accordion, praying. "Make them come back alive," she repeated. "Please, Lord, please, all of them." Even the wrinkles around her eyes were joining hands. The accordion must have ached her, but she remained. Rosa would never tell Hans about these moments, but Liesel believed that it must have been those prayers that helped Papa survive the LSE's accident in Essen. If they didn't help, they certainly can't have hurt. The accident. It was a surprisingly clear afternoon, and the men were climbing into the truck. Hans Huberman had just sat down at his appointed seat. Reinhold Zucker was standing above him. "Move it," he said. "Bitte? Excuse me?" So Reinhold Zucker, the guy who won, the 24-year-old who was not good at playing cards and he got mad when he lost, he told Hans, move it. "Bitte? Excuse me?" Zucker was hunched beneath the vehicle's ceiling. "I said move it, Arschloch." The greasy jungle of his fringe fell in clumps onto his forehead. "I'm swapping seats with you." Hans was confused. The back seat was probably the most uncomfortable of the lot. It was the draftiest, the coldest. Why? Does it matter? Zucker was losing patience. "Maybe I want to get off first to use this shithouse." Hans was quickly aware that the rest of the unit was already watching this pitiful struggle between two supposed grown men. He didn't want to lose, but he didn't want to be petty either. Also, they just finished a tiring shift, and he didn't have the energy to go on with it. Bent backed, he made his way forward to the vacant seat in the middle of the truck. "Why did you give in to that Scheisskopf?" the man next to him asked. Hans lit a match and offered a share of the cigarette. "The draft back there goes straight through my ears." The olive green truck was on its way toward the camp, maybe 10 miles away. Brunenweg was telling a joke about a French waitress when the left front wheel was punctured and the driver lost control. The vehicle rolled many times and the men swore as they tumbled with the air, the light, the trash, and the tobacco. Outside, the blue sky changed from ceiling to floor as they clamored for something to hold. When it stopped, they were all crowded into the right-hand wall of the truck, their faces wedged against the filthy uniform next to them. Questions of health were passed around until one of the men, Eddie Alma, started shouting. "Get this bastard off me!" He said it 3 times fast. He was staring into Reinhold Zucker's blinkless eyes. The damage, Essen. 6 men burned by cigarettes, 2 broken hands, several broken fingers, a broken leg for Hans Huberman, a broken neck for Reinhold Zucker, snapped almost in line with his earlobes. They dragged each other out until only the corpse was left in the truck. The driver, Helmut Broman, was sitting on the ground, scratching his head. "The tire," he explained, "it just blew." Some of the men sat with him and echoed that it wasn't his fault. Others walked around and smoking, asking each other if they thought their injuries were bad enough to be relieved of duty. Another small group gathered at the back of the truck and viewed the body. Over by a tree, a thin strip of intense pain was still opening in Hans Huberman's leg. "It should have been me," he said. "What?" the sergeant called over from the truck. "He was sitting in my seat." Helmut Broman regained his senses and climbed back into the driver's compartment. Sideways, he tried to start the engine, but there was no kicking it over. Another truck was sent for, as was an ambulance. The ambulance didn't come. "You know what that means, don't you?" said Boris Schipper. They did. When they resumed the trek back to camp, each man tried not to look down at Reinhold Zucker's open-mouthed sneer. "I told you we should have turned him face down," someone mentioned. A few times, some of them simply forgot and rested their feet on the body. Once they arrived, they all tried to avoid the task of pulling him out. When the job was done, Hans Huberman took the few abbreviated steps before the pain fractured in his leg and brought him down. An hour later, when the doctor examined him, he was told it was definitely broken. The sergeant was on hand and stood with half a grin. "Well, Huberman, looks like you got away with it, doesn't it?" He was shaking his round face, smoking, and he provided a list of what would happen next. "You'll rest up. They'll ask me what we should do with you. I'll tell them you did a great job." He blew some more smoke. "And I think I'll tell them you're not fit for the LSE anymore, and you should be sent back to Munich to work in an office or do whatever cleaning up needs to be done there. How does that sound?" Unable to resist a laugh within a grimace of pain, Hans replied, "It sounds good, Sergeant." Boris Schipper finished his cigarette. "Damn right it sounds good. You're lucky. You're lucky I like you, Huberman. You're lucky you're a good man and generous with the cigarettes." In the next room, they were making up the plaster. The bitter taste of questions. Just over a week after Liesel's birthday in mid-February, she and Rosa finally received a detailed letter from Hans Huberman. She ran inside from the mailbox and showed it to Mama. Rosa made her read it aloud, and they could not contain their excitement when Liesel read about his broken leg. She was stunned to the extent that she mouthed the next sentence only to herself. What is it? Rosa pushed. Salmensch? Liesel looked up from the letter, and she was close to shouting. The sergeant had been true to his word. He's coming home, Mama! Papa's coming home! They embraced in the kitchen, and the letter was crushed between their bodies. A broken leg was certainly something to celebrate. When Liesel took the news next door, Barbara Steiner was ecstatic. She rubbed the girl's arms and called out to the rest of her family. In their kitchen, the household of Steiners seemed buoyed by the news that Hans Huberman was returning home. Rudy smiled and laughed, and Liesel could see that he was at least trying. However, she could also sense the bitter taste of questions in his mouth. Why him? Why Hans Huberman and not Alex Steiner? He had a point. One toolbox, one bleeder, one bear. Since his father's recruitment to the army the previous October, Rudy's anger had been slow growing nicely. The news of Hans Huberman's return was all he needed to take a few steps further. He did not tell Liesel about it. There was no complaining that it wasn't fair. His decision was to act. He carried a metal case up Himmel Street at the typical thieving time of darkening afternoon. Rudy's toolbox. It was patchy red and the length of an oversized shoebox. It contained the following: rusty knife, ×1. Small flashlight, ×1. Hammer, ×2. One medium, one small. Hand towel, ×1. Screwdriver, ×3. Varying in size. Ski mask, ×1. Clean socks, ×1. Teddy bear, ×1. Liesel saw him from the kitchen door. Notice there's a teddy bear. A teddy bear. Liesel saw him from the kitchen window, his purposeful steps and committed face exactly like the day he'd gone to find his father. He gripped the handle with as much force as he could, and his movements were stiff with rage. The book thief dropped the towel she was holding and replaced it with a single thought. He's going stealing. She ran out to meet him. There was not even the semblance of a hello. Rudy simply continued walking and spoke through the cold air in front of him. Close to Tommy Mueller's apartment block, he said, "You know something, Liesel? I was thinking. You're not a thief at all," and he didn't give her a chance to reply. "That woman lets you in. She even leaves you cookies, for Christ's sake. I don't call that stealing. Stealing is what the army does, taking your father and mine." He kicked a stone and clanged against a gate, He walked faster. "All those rich Nazis up there on Grande Strasse, Gelbstrasse, Heidestrasse?" Liesel could concentrate on nothing but keeping up. They had already passed Frau Diller's and were well into Munich Street. "Rudy, how does it feel anyway?" "How does what feel?" "When you take one of those books." At that moment, she chose to keep still. If he wanted an answer, he'd have to come back, and he did. "Well," but again it was Rudy who answered, before Liesel could even open her mouth. "It feels good, doesn't it, to steal something back?" Liesel forced her attention to the toolbox, trying to slow him down. "What have you got in there?" He bent over and opened it up. Everything appeared to make sense, but the teddy bear. As they kept walking, Rudy explained the toolbox at length and what he would do with each item. For example, the hammers were for smashing windows and the towel was to wrap them up, to quell the sound. And the teddy bear? It belonged to Anna Marie Steiner and was no bigger than one of Liesel's books. The fur was shaggy and worn. The eyes and ears had been sewn back on repeatedly, but it was friendly looking nonetheless. "That," answered Rudy, "is the one master stroke. That's if a kid walks in while I'm inside. I'll give it to him to calm them down." "And what do you plan to steal?" He shrugged. "Money, food, jewelry, whatever I can get my hands on." It sounded simple enough. It wasn't until 15 minutes later, when Liesel watched the sudden silence on his face, that she realized Rudy Steiner wasn't stealing anything. The commitment had disappeared, and although he still watched the imagined glory of stealing, she could see that now he was not believing it. He was trying to believe it, and that's never a good sign. His criminal greatness was unfurling before his eyes, and the footsteps slowed and they watched the houses. Liesel's relief was pure and sad inside her. It was Gelbstrasse. On the whole, the houses sat dark and huge. Rudy took off his shoes and held them with his left hand. He took the toolkit with his right. Between the clouds there was a moon, perhaps a mile of light. "What am I waiting for?" he asked, but Liesel didn't reply. Again Rudy opened his mouth, but without any words. He placed the toolbox on the ground and sat on it. His socks grew cold and wet. "Lucky there's another pair in the toolbox," Liesel suggested, and she could see him trying not to laugh despite himself. Rudy moved across and faced the other way, and there was room for Liesel now as well. The book thief and her best friend sat back to back on a patchy red toolbox in the middle of the street. Each facing a different way, they remained for quite a while. When they stood up and went home, Rudy changed his socks and left the previous ones on the road. A gift, he decided, for Gelbstrasse. The spoken truth of Rudy Steiner. I guess I'm better at leaving things behind than stealing them. A few weeks later, the toolbox, it's interesting that stealing was kind of a relief for them, was kind of an emotional relief. And he wanted that relief, knowing that it is frustrated that his father had not come home, though Hans was going to. And the idea that somehow stealing would sort of be an emotional, a relief, but yet he couldn't do it. And so we left something instead. And there was some relief in that. A few weeks later, the toolbox ended up being good for at least something. Rudy cleared it of screwdrivers and hammers and chose instead to store in it as many of the Steiners' valuables for the next air raid. The only item that remained was the teddy bear. On March 9th, Rudy exited the house and with it when the sirens made their presence felt again in Molking. When the Steiners rushed down to Himmel Street, Michael Holzapfel was knocking furiously at Rosa Huberman's door. When she and Liesel came out, he handed them his problem. "My mother," he said, and the plums of blood still on his bandage. "She won't come out. She's sitting at the kitchen table." As the weeks wore on, Frau Holzapfel had not yet begun to recover. When Liesel came to read, the woman spent most of her time staring at the window. Her words were quiet, close to motionless. All brutality and reprimand were wrested from her face. It was usually Michael who said goodbye to Liesel or gave her the coffee and thanked her. Now this. So she is so distraught over her son's death, as is appropriate. She's just gone listless. She can't react in her old angry way anymore. The life's been sucked out of her. Rosa moved into action. She waddled swiftly through the gate and stood in the open doorway. "Holzapfel!" There was nothing but sirens and Rosa. "Holzapfel, get out here, you miserable old swine!" Attack had never been Rosa Huberman's strong point. "If you don't come out, we're all going to die here on the street." She turned and viewed the helpless figures on the footpath. A siren had just finished wailing. "What now?" Michael shrugged, disoriented, perplexed. Liesel dropped her bag of books and faced him. She shouted at the commencement of the next siren. "Can I go in?" But she didn't wait for an answer. She ran the short distance on the path and shoved past Mama. Frau Holzapfel was unmoved at the table. What do I say, Liesel thought. How do I get her to move? When the sirens took another breath, she heard Rosa calling out, "Just leave her, Liesel. We have to go. If she wants to die, that's her business." But then the sirens resumed. They reached down and tossed the voice away. Now it was only noise and the girl and wiry woman. "Frau Holzapfel, please!" Much like her conversation with Ilse Hermann on the day of the cookies, a multitude of words and sentences were at her fingertips. The difference was that today there were bombs. Today it was slightly more urgent. The options. "Frau Holzapfel, we have to go." "Frau Holzapfel will die if we stay here." "You still have one son left. Everyone's waiting for you. The bombs will blow your head off. If you don't come, I'll stop coming to read to you, and that means you've lost your only friend." She went with the last sentence, calling the words directly through the sirens. Her hands were planted on the table. The woman looked up and made her decision. She didn't move. Liesel left. She withdrew herself from the table and rushed from the house. Rosa held open the gate and they started running to number 45. Michael Holzapfel remained stranded on Himmel Street. "Come on," Rosa implored him. But the returned soldier hesitated. He was just about to make his way back inside when something turned him around. His mutilated hand was the only thing attached to the gate, and shamefully he dragged it free and followed. They all looked back several times, but there was still no Frau Holzapfel. The road seemed so wide, and when the final sirens evaporated into the air, the last 3 people on Himmel Street made their way into the Fiedler's basement. "What took you so long?" Rudy asked. He was holding the toolbox. Liesel placed the bag of books on the ground and sat on them. "We were trying to get Frau Holzapfel." Rudy looked around. "Where is she?" "At home, in the kitchen." In the far corners of the shelter, Michael was cramped and shivery. "I should have stayed," he said. "I should have stayed. I should have stayed." His voice was close to noiseless, but his eyes were louder than ever. They beat furiously in their sockets as he squeezed his injured hand, and the blood rose through the bandage. It was Rosa who stopped him. "Please, Michael, it's not your fault." But the young man with only a few remaining fingers on his right hand was inconsolable. He crouched in Rosa's eyes. "Tell me something," he said, "because I don't understand." He fell back and sat against the wall. "Tell me, Rosa, how can she sit there ready to die while I still want to live?" The blood thickened. "Why do I want to live? I shouldn't want to, but I do." The young man wept uncontrollably with Rosa's hand on his shoulder for many minutes. The rest of the people watched. He could not make himself stop even when the basement door opened and shut, and Frau Holzapfel entered the shelter. Her son looked away. Rosa stepped away. When they came together, Michael apologized. "Mama, I'm sorry. I should have stayed with you." Frau Holzapfel didn't hear. She sat only with her son and lifted his bandaged hand. "You're bleeding again," she said, and with everyone else they sat and waited. Liesel reached into her bag and rummaged through the books. The Bombing of Munich, March 9 and 10. The night was long with bombs and reading. Her mouth was dry, but the book thief worked through 54 pages. The majority of children slept and didn't hear the sirens of renewed safety. Their parents woke them or carried them up the basement steps into the world of darkness. Far away fires were burning, and I had picked up just over 200 murdered souls. I was on my way to Molking for one more. Himmel Street was clear. The sirens had been held off for many hours just in case there was another threat and to allow the smoke to make its way into the atmosphere. It was Bettina Steiner who noticed the small fire and the sliver of smoke farther down, close to the Amper River. It trailed into the sky, and the girl held up her finger. "Look!" The girl might have seen it first, but it was Rudy who reacted. In his haste, he did not relinquish his grip on the toolbox as he sprinted to the bottom of Himmel Street, took a few side roads, and entered the trees. Liesel was next, having surrendered her books to the heavily protesting Rosa, and then a smattering of people from several shelters along the way. "Rudy, wait!" Rudy did not wait. Liesel could see only the toolbox and certain gaps in the trees as he made his way through to the dying glow and the misty plain. It sat smoking in the clearing by the river. The pilot had tried to land there. Within 20 meters, Rudy stopped. Just as I arrived myself, I noticed him standing there, recovering his breath. The limbs of trees were scattered in the dark. There were twigs and needles littered around the plain like fire fuel. To their left, 3 gashes were burned into the earth. The runaway tick-tock of cooling metal sped up the minutes and seconds till they were standing there for what felt like hours. The growing crowd was assembling behind them, their breath and sentences sticking to Liesel's back. "Well," said Rudy, "shall we take a look?" He stepped through the remainder of trees to where the body of the plane was fixed to the ground. Its nose was in the running water, and the wings were left crookedly behind. Rudy circled slowly from the tail and around to the right. "There's glass," he said. The windshield is everywhere." Then he saw the body. Rudy Steiner had never seen a face so pale. "Don't come, Liesel." But Liesel came. She could see the barely conscious face of the enemy pilot as the tall trees watched and the river ran. The plane let out a few more coughs and the head inside tilted from left to right. The plane let out a few more coughs and the head tilted from left to right. He said something they obviously could not understand. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Rudy whispered. "He's alive." The toolbox bumped the side of the plane and brought with it the sound of more human voices and feet. The glow of fire was gone and the morning was still and black. Only the smoke was in its way, but it too would soon be exhausted. The wall of troops kept the color of a burning Munich at bay. By now the boy's eyes had adjusted not only to the darkness, but to the face of the pilot. His eyes were like coffee stains, and gashes were ruled across his cheeks and chin. A ruffled uniform sat, unruly, across his chest. Despite Rudy's advice, Liesel came even closer, and I can promise you that we recognized each other at that exact moment. "I know you," I thought. There was a train and a coughing boy. There was snow and a distraught girl. "You've grown," I thought, "but I recognize you." She did not back away or try to fight me, but I know that something told this girl I was there. Could she smell my breath? Could she hear my cursed circular heartbeat revolving like the crime it is in my deathly chest? I don't know, but she knew me, and she looked in my face, and she did not look away. As the sky began to charcoal toward light, we both moved on. We both observed the boy as he reached into the toolbox again and searched through some picture frames to pull out a small, stuffed, yellow toy. Carefully, he climbed to the dying man. He placed the smiling teddy bear cautiously onto the pilot's shoulder. The tip of its ear touched his throat. The dying man breathed it in. He spoke. In English he said, "Thank you." His straight-line cuts opened as he spoke, and a small drop of blood rolled crookedly down his throat. What? Rudy asked him. Was hast du gesagt? What did you say? Unfortunately, I beat him to the answer. The time was there, and the time was there, and I was reaching into the cockpit. I slowly extracted the pilot's soul from his ruffled uniform and rescued him from the broken plane. The crowd played with the silence as I made my way through. I jostled free. Above me, the sky eclipsed just a last moment of darkness, and I swear I could see a black signature in the shape of a swastika. It loitered untidily above. Heil Hitler, I said, but I was well into the trees by then. Behind me, a teddy bear rested on the shoulder of a corpse. A lemon candle stood below the branches. The pilot's soul was in my arms. It's probably fair to say that in all the years of Hitler's reign, no person was able to serve the Führer as loyally as me. A human doesn't have a heart like mine. The human heart is a line, whereas my own is a circle, and I have the endless ability to be in the right place at the right time. The consequence of this is that I'm always finding humans at their best and worst. I see their ugly and their beauty, and I wonder how the same thing can be both. Still, they have one thing I envy. Humans, if nothing else, have the good sense to die. Homecoming. It was a time of bleeders and broken planes and teddy bears. Isn't that something? He gave a teddy bear to the dying pilot. And he said in English, "Thank you." It was a time of bleeders and broken planes and teddy bears, but the first quarter of 1943 was to finish on a positive note for the book thief. At the beginning of April, Hans Huberman's plaster was trimmed to the knee, and he boarded a train for Munich. He would be given a week of rest and recreation at home before joining the ranks of army pen pushers in the city. He would help with the paperwork on the cleanup of Munich's factories, houses, churches, and hospitals. Time would tell if he would be sent out to do the repair work. That all depended on his leg and the state of the city. It was dark when he arrived home. It was a day later than expected, as the train was delayed due to an air raid scare. He stood at the door of 33 Himmel Street and made a fist. 4 years earlier, Liesel Memminger was coaxed through that doorway when she showed up for the first time. Max Vandenberg had stood there with a key biting into his hand. Now it was Hans Huberman's turn. He knocked 4 times, and the book thief answered. "Papa, Papa." She must have said it 100 times as she hugged him in the kitchen and wouldn't let go. Later, after they ate, they sat on the kitchen table long into the night, and Hans told his wife and Liesel Memminger everything. He explained the LSE and the smoke-filled streets and the poor, lost, wandering souls. And Reinhold Zucker, poor, stupid Reinhold Zucker. It took hours. At 1 a.m., Liesel went to bed, and Papa came in to sit with her, like he used to. She woke up several times to check that he was there, and he did not fail her. The night was calm. Her bed was warm and soft with contentment. Yes, it was that great night. It was a great night to be Liesel Memminger, and the calm, the warm, and the soft would remain for approximately 3 more months. But her story lasts for 6. Part 10. Let me see what our time is, 33. There's certain things I don't want to read to you. I want to do this in person. Just a second, I want to look and see. Excuse me, just a moment. I'm going to stop here. The rest I want to read in class. I don't want to read this on tape. Okay, we're going to stop here, you guys. Thanks. Talk to you again.